Welcome back. There are growing calls for the amendment of the country's parole laws. This comes after a man who was out on parole was arrested for allegedly raping a 9-year-old girl in Hanover Park in Cape Town. It is reported that the suspect locked the little girl inside his house and drugged her. Now, for reaction on the rising cases of violence against children, I'm now joined by Dr. Shaheda Omar, who's the director at the Teddy Bear Clinic. A very good evening to you, Dr. Omar. Unfortunately, again, another sad reality for children in South Africa. Of course, looking at that Hanover Park case as well with a 9-year-old girl who was allegedly raped. And then you've also got, of course, the little girl in Matadiele, in that case over there, where the NPA has said no one will be prosecuted there. And then, of course, another story that we're tracking in our news bulletins is of Jaden Lee Meek, who's the 11-year-old boy who was found dead in a residential complex. Family still has so many unanswered questions. Dr. Omar, again, why and how do we find ourselves in this position as a country?
I think if we have to look at the consequence management of offenders, and there seems to be a challenge around that. Firstly, a parolee, it's not the first time that a parolee has reoffended or victimized and preyed on vulnerable children. That is something that needs to be addressed stringently and urgently, because we know that rehabilitation and reintegration of sex offenders is a possibility, but that would depend on numerous factors. It's very complex and it requires an individualized approach. We cannot use a one-size-fits-for-all. So the monitoring of parolees, ensuring that they're in safe housekeeping, where there's constant vigilance, electronic monitoring, where they also have curfew, but they're not allowed to live within the general community. I think these are some of the challenges that we've been faced with, and parolees are posing a significant risk to children and to other victims in the communities that we are living in. So again, I think law enforcement needs to come to the party, but we also need justice. We need proper, when we talk about convicted people going onto the sex offender, and if they are released on parole, there needs to be very stringent conditions. They cannot be left out, but I think it requires more than that, a vigilant community who are informed that this is a high-risk individual who people have to actually look out for to ensure and monitor the safety of their families.
Dr. Omar, how well informed can these communities be when we don't have the sex offenders list public?
Unfortunately, not very well informed. I would say ill-informed at all times, because as we speak, there's a phased-in approach by the Minister of Justice regarding superintendents of hospitals, CEOs of companies, heads of schools. So it's going to be a phased-in approach, but I think it needs to be more swifter. It's got to be brought in sooner than later. Otherwise, we are going to find that more and more children and communities are faced with the scourge of violence against children, the death, the brutalization, the raping of children who cannot protect themselves, who are defenseless, who are not in a position to actually even reach out, cry out for help. So I think this is something that requires immediate attention. We cannot delay this any longer.
Earlier you mentioned consequence management as well, and I'd like to know what's your reaction in this case where the Department of Correctional Services has confirmed that they've begun the proceedings to revoke this particular alleged offender's parole as well, but also that there'll be an internal investigation. You've also mentioned, of course, we know this isn't the first case that we're seeing where a parolee reoffends as well, particularly when it is violence against children. What do you make of the Department of Correctional Services response to say, look, we are beginning the process to make sure that we take this person off the streets again? Is it a little too late?
It's a little too late. I think it's damage control. They're just rushing into rescuing the situation. Unfortunately, harm has already been done, and this is something that has been brought to the attention of the authorities. One cannot guarantee that it hasn't already happened to other victims. So, and unfortunately, many parolees have gone to brutally and fatally wound children. So this requires, as I say, immediate. And I think they just now, it's putting a band-aid, and a band-aid approach is not the way to go. We need to react and mobilize action where action speaks words and holds perpetrators accountable and deters other potential perpetrators.
And speaking of being able to react and also mobilize as well, in recent weeks, we also saw massive public outcry, lots of reaction, mobilization when it came to the Justice for Kwekwe case as well, the 7-year-old girl in Matatiele who was allegedly raped. We've seen the outcome now with the NPA saying they're not going to be moving forward with that case. There's still, again, outcry. However, it seems that nothing's going to be done. What do you make of that case in particular?
Very, very disappointing, extremely disappointing that there was no reason to shut the case or to remove it, take it off the roll. I think there's been a huge oversight on the part of the NPA. All they had to do is that keep it open and, of course, explore it to its fullest extent. And now, of course, there's an opportunity now to go back and review and say law enforcement needs to go back and do investigations. So I think, one needs to foster collaboration between the different government departments and ensure that there's a whole of society approach. As you can see, the community is in outrage, but it's not only the community. Civil society organizations are also in outrage. The children's sector is actually cannot believe what we are actually seeing happening on the ground. So that is our response now. We want to take action to ensure that children and the child in Matatiele, the children in Matatiele, and so many other children in this country are not faced with this kind of challenge where they are then disappointed and let down by the very systems that should protect them.
And Dr. Omar, as people working in this profession as well and ensuring that there is some sort of justice, when you do engage with those relevant departments, what kind of a reaction are you getting?
Well, the kind of reaction, what's interesting is that they come to the table and very willing. I think they're willing horses. And one is not actually sure whether it's because of lack of resources, undercapacitation, but they have made promises to address and to work in collaboration to foster this collaborative environment. But we're not seeing the action on the ground. And this is where we actually need to push them to that point where there is action and that consequence management takes place, where we do not see a repeat of these kind of crimes.
Well, if we also look at research as well, it also will show us where exactly in some areas there seems to be, hotspots where there's repeat offenders, repetition of this crime. This latest case in Hanover Park, again, puts to the forefront the Cape Flats. With recent studies that show that over 2,300 parolees have been released to the Cape Flats. And again, going back to that sex offenders list not being made public as well, that community is then kind of left exposed.
Indeed, I think not only is the community left exposed, but the community is actually, they've been thrown to the wolves. There's absolutely no control of how they're going to be managing or monitoring. How can one manage and monitor so many parolees and still still take care and ensure the safety of each and every child in that community? I think that, it's just shocking that there is no kind of structure to ensure that people are protected and the people that are dangerous and are at a risk to the community need to be actually kept away from these kind of settings where they have opportunistic engagement with vulnerable population groups like children. Because many of these parolees are not opportunistic. They are actually compulsive. So rehabilitation and reintegration into these communities is not going to help the community. It's going to result in further harm to the community.
And just briefly, what then should happen to those in those cases where rehabilitation is clearly not possible?
well, in those cases, there needs to be specific housing, specific, as I said, electronic monitoring, and where probation services are, in operation, executed thoroughly, where there's efficiency and proficiency, where these people do not have access to children, and children would not come into their territory, and even communities, I think, should be protected from them. So they should be actually kept away from general communities.
Dr. Omar, really appreciate your insights as always. Thank you so much for your time.